Welcome to the M&A Unplugged podcast. Our mission is to help you be better prepared for your business acquisition or sale. Being prepared will ensure you maximize returns and minimize risks. This is M&A Unplugged with your host, Domenic Rinaldi.
Welcome back. I'm Domenic Rinaldi, host of the M&A Unplugged podcast. It may sound obvious and border on being cliche, but failure to properly communicate an acquisition can have disastrous results. You run the risk of losing employee loyalty, jeopardizing your culture, client defections, vendor disappointment, and you might even open the door for competitors to take advantage during the integration phase. You can avoid this common pitfall by following a simple communications framework that sets you up for success. My guest today, Andrew Cross, is a partner and senior vice president at Walker Sands, one of the nation's top integrated marketing firms. Andrew has been involved in a number of M&A transactions, helping clients build a successful communication strategy and execution plan so the right messages are shared to maximize employee, client, and vendor retention while preserving the company's brand. Andrew shares a framework that all businesses can follow to ensure you protect the company's assets and set the tone for the future. He also stressed the importance of making sure that any communication plan includes a feedback loop so the management team is getting ahead of any issues. Communication should not be an afterthought. I know you'll get some great takeaways. Before we get into today's episode, if you want to avoid common deal pitfalls, the risk of losing substantial dollars, you need to know how ready you really are for a transaction. Because I believe proper preparation is so critical to your deal success, we have published several free resources to help you be better prepared. You can access these resources on our website at www.𝐾2advisor.com/resources. Being prepared is critical to ensuring that you maximize returns and minimize risks. Thank you for being here and hope you enjoyed today's episode. Andrew, welcome to M&A Unplugged.
Hey, Domenic, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you here. I know the firm that you work for very well. You guys are a first-class operation, and evidenced by the fact that how much you've grown over the last 5 years. It's amazing to see what your company's done.
Thanks so much. Yeah, Inc. 5000. I think this was maybe our 8th year in a row. So still growing pretty steady. Appreciate the recognition.
Absolutely. So maybe we could start with, if you could provide the M&A Unplugged community a quick backgrounder on yourself, and then we're going to dive into communication and how important it is in an M&A transaction.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm an SVP at Walker Sands. For those who aren't familiar with us, we're an integrated marketing firm. We work specifically with B2B tech and services companies. We're based in Chicago. I'm, joining you from the western suburbs, but we've got offices on the West Coast as well, in San Francisco and Seattle. And I lead the PR group, right? So the communications function for Walker Sands for our clients. As it relates to M&A specifically, there's typically a couple places we engage, right? One is with growth stage companies. We're working with a lot of, tech companies, often venture-backed companies, that they want to use PR from a storytelling standpoint to justify a premium valuation, right? A high multiple at exit. And so, we're working with them in that capacity. And we've had clients, acquired by PayPal and Salesforce and MasterCard and DocuSign and a bunch of tier one companies like that, sort of positioning them for an exit. But on the other side of the coin, we're working with companies that are acquisitive. Maybe they're sort of a platform play and PE backed or self-funded, but they're rolling up competitors. They're using M&A to sort of expand into, adjacent markets. And in those cases, we are typically handling sort of the communications framework around the acquisition, from strategy, through to tactics and execution as well.
And it's so awesome to hear that people are actually leveraging you as an asset in that communication, because, it's easy to say, you need to have communications during a merger or an acquisition. But I don't think people sometimes really connect the dots because there's a lot at risk, right? I mean, if you get the communication wrong, you miss or you risk potentially losing your employee loyalty, whether it's your existing employees or the employees that you're, trying to merge into your existing company. Culture is at risk, right? I mean, if you don't communicate right, your culture's at, and then your client retention is at risk. So there's a lot at stake if you don't communicate. And unfortunately, I think this piece of the M&A world is dealt with almost as an afterthought. Like, oh, looks like we're going to close this deal next week. Well, how are we going to communicate it? And it's like left to the last moment.
Yep.
Such an important piece because there's really a lot at risk.
And the common thread, Dominic, of what you just said is ambiguity, right? Because that's what M&A can introduce. If you are an employee or a customer, it's introducing some level of ambiguity into the environment where you're at risk of disenfranchising an employee group, or it could present kind of a missed opportunity for you to be proactive and get in front of some of that. I think what you said is really important, right? Which is that as a CEO, you spend so much time on the transaction, right? Whether it's the financial structure of the deal, it's the due diligence coming together, it's incentivizing future leaders. There's so much going on. I think it's easy to poke your head up 2 days before close and say, hey, we've got to communicate this thing, right, to some extent. And so, I think the most important thing is just, be thoughtful about it, try to be proactive about it. When we work with clients, we sometimes try to get engaged, I would say as early as 6 weeks prior to close. Oftentimes we only get a couple weeks though, and that's okay. But you don't want to leave it up until the last minute because you are kind of setting yourself up for failure to some extent at that point.
Without a doubt. And I know we're going to get into a framework that, we can give to people so they've got something to think about, but it's no replacement for experts, right? I mean, this is such a sensitive issue. But when we think about communication, and what I try to communicate to our clients is you really have two separate constituents. You have your internal and you have your external. Internally, you've got the employees, and I include vendors in the internal because they're really part of your ecosystem. And then you've got the external, who are your clients, and then the marketplace, broadly speaking, where your future clients are going to come from, or your competitors are paying attention, right? And so you've got different constituents. Is the messaging different, internally, externally? How do you advise clients around how to walk that line between the internal and the external?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the best place to start, right? And so whether you use an agency like Walker Sands or whether you frame this up yourself, I mean, step one, right? Pull up a spreadsheet and start going through exactly what you just said, Dominic, which is who are all of our audiences? Who are the stakeholders? And so you're going to have employees, like you said, and clients and customers, partners, vendors, media and analysts. If you're in the financial services or some other industries, there could even be a regulatory audience. So your business better than anybody. Get those audiences down on paper. I would say, look for ways you can segment those audiences. What are the logical ways to segment? So for employees, you might have management and you might have contributors. You might have headquarters employees and field employees. For clients, your business might have sort of tier 1, tier 2, right, by spend or other sort of logical groupings of those audiences. So get them on paper, and then as a fast follow, you want to go through and say, okay, what do each of these groups care about? What are they going to be most concerned about with respect to M&A? And for employees, I can tell you it's self-preservation, right? Is my job safe? Right. In many cases. For clients, it's probably more about continuity, right? Continuity of service or continuity of relationship. But bottom line, this is an exercise in empathy, right? And if you're a business owner, your empathy muscle is probably pretty strong, and it's sort of going through putting yourself in each of those audiences' shoes and saying, what do I care most about with respect to this news? And then once you have that, you can step into sort of messaging, channel, and timing, which is kind of where the rubber meets the road on some of this stuff.
I think that is such a good point. And that's sort of that's like maybe communication 101, right? You always have to be thinking about, what does that other person want? What's in it for them? What do they care about? And if you get that right, you can work your way from there. So I think it's a point well taken. So I take it, in your framework, that's step number one. Who are the audiences and what do they care about?
Absolutely. And to your point, Dominic, you always want to be thinking about, what do you want to say, but you also need to understand, what does the audience need to hear, right? So by looking at it through both of those lenses, you're already a step ahead.
Yeah. So what does the rest of the framework look like when a client brings you in and you're contemplating managing this process for them?
Yeah. So I would say the next 3 steps, it's what's the message, what's the channel, and what's the timing, right? So from a message standpoint, first I would think about what's the narrative, the high level narrative, right? If you zoom out to the 10,000 foot view and you say, like, what really matters about this M&A event, that's your narrative. And I think probably 98% of the deals that I've been involved with or been exposed to, the narrative is world domination, right? It's some derivative of that. And maybe it's Toyota dealerships in the tri-state area, or maybe it's, Class B, properties in Chicagoland, right? It's your own slice of the universe, but it's how are we going to be bigger and better? I think the only exception I can think to that is I had a client years ago that was sort of a forced divestiture situation, right? Where the DOJ said that the number 1 company in the industry had to spin out the number 2. Our client was the number 3 and they bought them. And so it was the opposite narrative, right? About fairness of competition in the marketplace. But in every other case, it's sort of about how are we made sort of bigger or better, and what can we provide based on that? Is it better pricing? Is it more services? What does that sort of mean? And that's really where you step through for each of those audiences. What are the top 2 or 3 things that you want those audiences to know? And you want to consider that segmentation as well, right? So there's going to be a slightly different message for the acquiring company's existing customers versus the customers of the company that was acquired, right? Which is probably, much more sensitive in that regard. And through all of that, you want to think about, what's the tone that you want to convey? Is it one of optimism? Is it confidence? What do you really want to project?
Yeah. Boy, I think you really made a great point there. I think a lot of people think when they're acquiring a business, they're only communicating to the clients and the employees that are being acquired. But you made a subtle point there that you really are communicating to both sets of clients and all of the employees, right? And so everybody has a level set on what the company's trying to achieve.
Absolutely. And it's a missed opportunity if you don't, right? Because for communicating the customers of the acquired company, it's probably a little bit of a risk mitigation narrative, right? Because they might have concerns. They might worry that the product or service might, be collapsed somehow, that they'll lose their relationship contact, whatever those dynamics are. And so there's a little bit of a risk mitigation element in some ways. For your existing customers, if you just acquired that business, the customers you already have, it's about, hey, this is just validation of growth, of us being able to provide a better product or service to you. These are the ways that we see in the future you potentially benefiting from this, and hopefully generating some excitement and enthusiasm. So yeah, if you're not using it as an opportunity to communicate to all of your audiences, you're probably just leaving sort of value on the table to some extent, right?
Yeah. When people miss the mark on messaging, what's the typical misses? How are they getting it wrong on the messaging?
I would say typically it's something that comes across as tone deaf, right? And that goes back to actually the point that you raised earlier, which is if you're only saying what you want to say and you're not saying what people need to know, then you've missed the mark, right? If people's number one concern is my job safe? Are my coworkers' jobs safe? And you're talking all about pricing and product innovation, then you've missed the mark. You're not addressing the number one concern. So that's why if you sort of follow these steps of the framework, hopefully you don't necessarily run that risk.
Got it. So the next step is channels. You've got your audience set, you know what they want to hear or need to hear. You got your messaging. Now you're contemplating channels. What's involved there?
Yeah. So channel is just, how do you want that to come across, right? What's the right vehicle for that message? And so for employees, right, in a lot of cases, it probably is an all hands type meeting, or today maybe in a Zoom environment, right? You want to get employees all together. I will say you want to consider tone. So this is something, we've advised clients on, where if you say that this is a celebratory event, this is a milestone for the business, this is something people should be excited about, but you have a somber meeting with a couple PowerPoint slides and then people shuffle back to their desks, like that doesn't invoke celebration. You need champagne bottles. You need to really celebrate the event in a meaningful way. Have it at the end of the day where employees can kind of unwind afterwards, whatever the case may be. You probably want to follow up with an email to all employees. It's important to put it in writing. Some people get information in different ways and they kind of need that in writing. One place this can go wrong, and we always tell clients, is assume that your internal email that you send to all staff is going to be published in its entirety in the media. Just assume it's going to be, all it takes is one employee to hit forward on that email.
Yeah.
And that gets out. Nothing is really private. But you want to think about what's appropriate for your business. For clients, you may want to, if you've got a sort of 20-80 dynamic, right, where like most of your revenue is coming from a small percentage of clients, there's probably, C-level phone call conversations taking place right there. If you're a SaaS business and, companies are engaging with you by buying your service for $5 per user per month kind of thing, and they only talk to you twice a year, an email is probably completely fine. So what's best for your business, but make sure that the channel reflects, right, the audience, their concerns, and the messaging and the tone.
What if you, and let's take it maybe two ways. It's a investor group that's buying their first business, or you're a business buying another one, and you're not really certain. You haven't gotten your hands completely around the culture of the employees and the vendors and the clients. So you're not really certain about the proper way to communicate. Is there a way to figure that out quickly and on the fly so you don't mess it up?
It's a good question. I mean, I would say step one is lean on the resources that you have, right? The current owners of that business. In the case of the investment group scenario, try to suss out as much of that as you can. But the other thing I would say is it's not necessarily a one-time event, right? I think follow through is very important too. So there is the announcement itself, which is kind of your lightning rod moment, and there's a lot of excitement, but there's also follow through. So once you have that initial announcement, there should be a fast follow with maybe, mid or upper level management to say, hey, what open questions are there? What are you hearing from your people? Make sure you have a feedback loop and sort of a mechanism to gather those things so that you can follow up a week later and say, hey, we've heard that there have been some questions around this. Here are some of those answers, or what we can tell you now. Maybe there's, management, sort of next level down, director level meetings with the new investors, for example, just to get them familiar and comfortable with each other. So I would look at sort of follow-on activities, right? Of how can you, even if you don't get it perfect the first time, how can you continue to build trust over the long haul? Because that's what you need over the next 5 years, right? Is that sort of trusting relationship and how that gets built.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. To take it one step further, I think really approaching this as though it should be a two-way communication, right? How do you open the door up for employees, clients, and vendors to provide feedback? Make sure they've got a channel back, right? Because you can build the communication plan, but if you miss the mark, you want to know you missed the mark. And if you don't have a way for people to bring that messaging back to you, you might be floating in the ocean and not even know you've got a hole in the tank.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's one of the benefits of, I think, working with a firm like ours, is we touch enough of these situations where, we can tell you, here are the top 10 questions employees are going to have. Here are the questions, if you think about it from a media standpoint, same way. Media want to understand financial terms of the deal, strategy and trajectory of the business. They want to know what's going to happen to the brand, what's going to happen to company leadership. How does this impact, headcount now and in the future? It's the same starting point, right, of questions that can kind of go into this framework. But then you're always going to have the nuance and kind of the give and take of the specific company and the specific situation. And that's where you really need that feedback loop that you're talking about.
Got it. And then timing. This is always an interesting one, right? I mean, my view of timing is, there's some owners that don't want any communication going out to anyone until the money's hit the bank.
Yeah.
And then you have some situations where that's just not possible. You need to have some level of communication before the deal closes, whether that's because you have to shore up client contracts, vendor contracts, or you've got key employees that you have to get signed under employment agreements. So
yep,
it really is dependent. But what are your what's your high level guidance on timing?
Those are great points that you bring up. I would say as a general rule, you just don't want employees finding out from other sources, right? That's kind of the number one thing I think to avoid. You don't want an employee to read it in the newspaper, see it online, hear about it from a customer. So that's kind of what you want to work around. To your point, right? Conversations with some of the top clients or customers, like that could be part of late stage due diligence. So some clients may know about it pre-close. And so I think that's something to certainly consider. But yeah, you want to keep it as tight as possible. I mentioned segmentation earlier in terms of you might have management employees and contributing employees. You don't want to slice that too thin, because if you've got lots and lots of small groups to communicate to, it's just hard logistically to schedule that all out. Some people find out about it before others. People jump on social media, they're texting, they're slacking each other, whatever the mechanism is, and you've sort of lost control of that process. So as much as possible when it comes to the sort of run of show, you might call it, right, for the day of or week of, you want to keep that pretty tight, where maybe a small group of senior leaders find out first, there's an all staff meeting, top clients find out as a fast follow, and then kind of off you go with some of those other, external audiences.
Yeah.
For one of our clients I was working with earlier this year, they've got a global business. And so the way we set it up is they did a live in-person meeting in the US in the morning. They live streamed that announcement to their UK office in the afternoon, same time. And then they had an office in India. So they recorded the whole thing and sent an email with a video clip for all of their employees in India. So you got to do the best with kind of what you have.
Sure.
One other kind of interesting anecdote there, just from a macro timing standpoint, I had a client a couple of years ago, a company in Minnesota that bought a company out of Denmark. And I was working with a communications contact in Copenhagen who was doing some of the local communications. And he said, "Hey, when are you going to announce this deal?" And I said, "Well, it closes in 7 or 10 days. And that's when we plan to announce it." And this was in late June. And he said, "Just so you know, in Denmark, things slow down pretty dramatically in July. Everybody's on holiday." And that was news to us, and it was news to the leaders of that business. And what we did is we ended up announcing the deal. But in terms of the CEO flying out to Denmark, in terms of fanfare and vision casting, like on the ground with employees, that all was punted until people were back in the office, because Denmark, I learned, basically shuts down in the month of July. That may or may not be true, but that's what our local contact told us. So there's nuances like that, I think, that's worth considering as well.
Yeah, that's all a very good point. Let me ask, you're brought in by the acquiring entity or the individual or the investor group that's making the acquisition most often than not. But one issue that I've seen rear its ugly head more often than not is employees or maybe certain clients or vendors feel slighted because the previous or the current ownership didn't let them in on the fact that the company was being sold. And I know your advice and your fiduciary is to the acquiring company, but what would you advise the current owner of that business as far as messaging goes to all of those constituents? Because I've actually been in meetings where it got contentious that, there were people
Yeah.
who spent 30, 35 years in the business and they felt really badly that they didn't know. Now, that said, there was no other way to do it. Like, to tell them ahead of time would have been the wrong thing. So put that previous owner in a really tight spot. Any advice? Have you come across this before?
It's a tough situation. And I think, why is that the case, right? The reason they're feeling that way is because they feel invested in the business, not literally invested. They're not an equity owner, but they feel invested because they've been a customer for 30 years or they've been a valued employee. And so they have an ownership mentality. And I think you're right. In many cases, it's not appropriate. It's not an option to give them notice in advance. I think you just have to do everything you can to demonstrate that they are valued to you in the context of that relationship. And talk about, I think you can even address it. Like, I wanted to let you know this beforehand, but here I am, and this is what I'm telling you. And this is what it's going to look like going forward. And is there an opportunity to involve them going forward, right? In some kind of a customer advisory board or other kind of pseudo leadership function? I would look at that if that's a significant risk for the business. If there's just one customer, look, I don't know that you have to totally bend over backwards and throw everything for a loop for one customer. If that's a trend and that's an issue that is concerning, then you may want to think about how can you set up an advisory board or something to really kind of engender that going forward if that does represent a risk to the business. At the same time, at the end of the day, this is a big change. Like I mentioned ambiguity earlier, right? Yeah. There's some level of ambiguity that gets introduced here that not everyone can get their arms around, and not everyone is going to be involved with moving forward. And as you know, that's a natural part of the process. And I think sometimes that's okay. And that can even be healthy in some ways.
Yeah. And look, change is hard, right? It's a change, and change is hard. Most people have a tough time dealing with change. Some, can get over it faster than others.
Yep.
But it's a change. And I think it's also something for the acquiring company or the acquirers to think about, right? They have to know that there's that sensitivity that people weren't let in on the news, and get ahead of that as well. And maybe even help that owner out with that messaging. So,
absolutely.
What role do surveys play, if any, in your opinion, on communication? Whether it's surveys that are done before the acquisition or surveys after the acquisition?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, in our context, we probably see it less just given the B2B environment. And I think that's something you might see more in B2C of a large customer base and things like that. For us, in a lot of cases, we're not brought in for the M&A activity specifically. It's an existing relationship that we have where we know that company fairly well. And so if they've done customer surveys, employee surveys, those are all data points that hopefully we would have on file, and we can use it to inform the communication. So I think it just goes back to who's putting together that communications framework. But any data that you already have, to the extent that you can lean on that to develop that, it's just going to give you a better output.
Yeah, I will say that I've seen a recent trend towards doing these surveys more and more. And obviously the surveys are disguised, right? They're not calling up and saying, hey, looks like the company might get acquired and we're doing this survey. It's more around, hey, we're doing this customer satisfaction survey, or we're doing an employee satisfaction survey. And nobody's mentioning that it has to do with an acquisition, but it gives the acquiring company or the acquirers a data point around the client base and the employee base, which could help inform, what the communication should look like, or the areas of sensitivity after the acquisition is done.
Absolutely. Hopefully, right? Best case scenario, you're just validating what you already sort of believe to be true.
Yes.
But yeah, there's a scenario where that surfaces blind spots that you're not aware of, in which case, you want to feed that into the communications process as much as you can.
Yeah. Yeah. We just had that happen on a deal. The acquirer would not close unless there was a survey, satisfaction survey done.
Oh, no kidding.
And thankfully, it was exactly what the owner had told them. Clients were very happy. Employees were very happy, but they would not close on the transaction until that survey was done.
Oh, wow.
And so, and it was done at the very tail end once all the other diligence was done, as one of the last things before closing. So no surprise, once the deal got announced, everybody, then knew, well, that survey was taking place for a reason.
Exactly.
Well, Andrew, this is tremendous information. Bringing it up a notch as we look to close up the interview here, are there some high level comments that you would offer up to the M&A Unplugged community when it comes to communication? And maybe it's even beyond this topic that we're talking about.
Well, look, I would say going back to the top of the conversation, right, I think is be intentional about it. Don't leave this till the last minute. But a couple other things. I would say that, it's only as good as your follow through, from a business owner, operator point of view. Like the best communications plan in the world is not a substitute for doing what you said you were going to do, right? Because the communications is a jumping off point. And so, it's all about what happens downstream from that, and that follow through's got to be there, or you sort of lose credibility. So I think that's one. And then two is, try to use this as a moment in time and kind of a lightning rod moment to build your brand externally and generate awareness and credibility through, PR and demand generation and other activities. Because this is kind of a moment in time, but it's one that captures a lot of interest. People are paying attention. You mentioned earlier, competitors are paying attention, right? So this is a moment that can kind of be a foundational building block for hopefully, scaling and growing in a big way. And hey, you're investing in communications now, continue to invest in that going forward, because there's a big opportunity for businesses who are growing through M&A.
Without a doubt. Well, Andrew, really appreciate you being here. If folks wanted to get in touch with you, how could they reach you?
Yeah, so 𝐷𝐾𝐨𝐽.com. My email is andrew.cross, CROSS, @𝐷𝐾𝐨𝐽.com, or find me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active there.
All right, awesome. Andrew, thanks again for being here.
Thanks, Dominic. Appreciate it.
Hope you enjoyed this episode. All of today's information will be available in the show notes. If you enjoy our content, please remember to subscribe and review our podcast. I look forward to seeing you again on the next episode of the M&A Unplugged podcast. And until then, please remember that scaling, acquiring, or selling a business takes time, preparation, and the proper knowledge.